You have a paper starting with the question, why Eurasia? Point there is that if you look at the last 10,000 years or whatever, the technological military edge, it hasn't always been in Europe, but it has always been somewhere in Eurasia.
The rise of Europe is a relatively recent thing in human history. For the most part of the past 10,000 years, the wealthiest part of the world were in Middle East and China. Most of the human trade happened between these regions. So the why Eurasia question is try to look at what factor contributed to earlier rise of agriculture in Eurasia, and particularly look at the question that Jared Diamond first talked about in his magnificent book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was the fact that Eurasia was particularly well endowed with domesticable species, particularly animals. So I was trying to figure out why that was the case.
What were Diamond's answers?
Diamond has a really good summary, one sentence summary of his book, which is that differences in human population with regard to their development is rooted in differences in environment and not on genetic or biological differences between population. And he goes through his book, which he tries to explain in the book why descendant of Eurasian civilization, Europeans particularly dominated the rest of the world after 1500. It's a task that before him, Alfred Crosby has done in another book called Ecological Imperialism. Showed like the main difference between Eurasia and other continents that they highlight is the difference in animal population, particularly animals that have the traits that allowed for human domestication of a species. Those animals like pig, cow, sheep, like, later horse and donkeys and all of those camels, they really contributed to the productivity of agriculture, and they were, source of wealth and surplus, those animals, the herd animals. So it allows for wealth accumulation at a scale that wasn't possible in the absence of those animals. When it comes to the, later event, particularly European colonization, and why Europeans so in a really short amount of time were able to colonize America, with the differences that they cause in terms of disease environment and the fact that indigenous population of the America were like pretty much defenseless against European pathogens. Almost all of the Eurasian epidemic diseases that, infectious pathogen at some point originated from animals and they adopted to humans. You can think of COVID as a recent example of similar process. And not just that, it was the fact that dense population lived in close proximity to animals in many areas of Eurasia, which provided the opportunity for those pathogens to jump, in a sense, to humans. So yeah, like I think domesticable animals and herd animals contributed a lot to the differences in disease environment between old world and new world.
What about the other part of Diamond's explanation? Because he says that there are two things. One is this whole business about domestication, and Eurasia, for whatever reason, being the first to start domesticating animals and plants, taking in more calories from these domesticated plants and animals, having the animals that leads into the germs is a nice addition to that. But there is another part of his argument, which is that Eurasia is, first of all, really big. And secondly, it's an east-west supercontinent. There are no Silk Roads from Mexico to Peru because you have to go through so many different climatic zones when you're moving south to north. Whereas when you're moving to east to west, you can move in relatively similar climatic zones, which leads into, Silk Roads is just a kind of catchword for this incredible amount of constant, movement of ideas between the east and the west, for the lack of a better word. And the reason that I think that some people might say that this is the more important part of Diamond's answer is that the germs were very, very, they were devastating for the Native Americans. But then when Europeans also did a pretty thorough job at colonizing Africa, and there the disease environment was certainly not in the European favor. And so in a sense, I guess the argument there would be that the one thing that really happened to be kind of culminating in Europe around those critical year 1500 or whatnot was the fact that you just happened to have a lot of inventions, especially military inventions, but also information technology inventions, everything from guns to printing press to sailing boats with compasses, and that all of these things, if you trace where they come from, very, very few of those things is an indigenously European idea. And that it's actually this flow of ideas that the East-West orientation allows might be the most important explanation, because that doesn't only allow us to explain what happened in the Americas, but also what happens later in Africa, for example.
Yeah, I think those continental geography factor are really important. I don't think they're as important as Diamond portrayed it. So I think what is lacking from Diamond theory is the fact that when you compare continents, yes, like, a lot of the things that he said is correct. But again, that there's a lot of variation inside Eurasia that is really important, perhaps even more important than continental differences. Big chunk of interesting differences happened within Eurasia. And that's where my research coming, because what Diamond attribute to Eurasian civilization, it was only happening in the southern part of Eurasia. The low latitudes of Eurasia were particularly well endowed with domesticable animals. So a theory of explaining the rise of Eurasia should explain not only continental differences, but what was it about the low latitudes of Eurasia, the southern stretch from pretty much Turkey to China, that was particularly conducive to domestication and agriculture. That is my focus. So trying to complement Diamond's story and trying to figure out what was it about that region.
So we have the question, why Eurasia? And you say that it's important to notice that one thing is that animals play a big part in this early start of agriculture and the importance of domesticated animals. This is not something that happens everywhere in Eurasia. It happens in this kind of the southern band of Eurasia, from Turkey to China, as you said. And Diamond kind of leaves it at that. He just says, well, they just had they just had good animals to domesticate. They had good wild grasses to domesticate. And you're suggesting that we can dig deeper, that there is a story to be told of why agriculture took on in these areas, and why did animal husbandry take over these areas so much earlier and with so much force than in other parts of the world. Why?
A lot of these species were located in regions that were settled and occupied since the humans out of African migration, starting from our distant cousin Homo erectus, which migrated out of Africa around 2 million years ago, a little later. So Homo erectus, in the, as a joke probably in biology, used to show, it's called the meat man or the elephant man, because it was following meat.
Oh, interesting. So they followed the meat all the way to Indonesia.
Yes, and the research that has been done shows that Homo erectus just was going back and forth between Eastern Asia and Western. Like they weren't like, they were really following the herds. It's kind of like feels like a really big coincidence that the areas outside Africa that were settled by human species first and continuously since Homo erectus migration happen to be regions that have the highest endowment of all kinds of domesticable plants and animals. And same regions happen to be, they were occupied by Homo sapiens also around when they migrated out of Africa, and agriculture happened in the same areas. So I was like, this is not a coincidence. There should be a little bit more to it.
Okay, so the meat man, the Homo erectus, they run east to west, on this wonderful east-west axis that we already discussed. And somehow from under their footsteps rises these wild grasses and these big mammals that just happen to be the ones that we now look at as, oh, these were great to domesticate.
Right.
Very convenient. Okay, I see. So let's continue. What do the stampeding rounds of the Homo erectus running behind the meat, how do they explain domesticability much later on when because we're talking about the domestication only happens like a blink of an eye before present when we think about like a 2 million year period.
These species evolved to have those traits that allowed for their domestication. And then the question is, what is those things that resulted in evolution of a species in ways that resulted in later those species being domesticable? That's where the extinction comes in. A lot of animals around the time humans started migrating, particularly started around 40,000, 30,000 years ago, started going extinct as human population expanded out of Africa. When you look at, particularly in Africa, actually, like a lot of the animals that existed, like evolved with human, since our birth as a species, they're still there. So some species went extinct, but a lot of the species that we see today, they are the species that our ancestors dealt with. It's not the same in Eurasia and America. Like a lot of the species that humans encounter went extinct in those other regions outside Africa. So like biologists and ecologists says we evolve in a world of giants. We stand on the shoulder of giants that do not exist anymore.
Yes, yes.
Think about the tribe of humans, and they rely on large mammals. All human population in Eurasia particularly relied on large mammals for survival. So if there is a threat of extinction, then as we have seen throughout history, humans who really depends on these animals are trying to save them. So instead of just hunting these animals and not coordinating with probably other human tribes and not worrying about it because they're so abundant, then if they become threatened, then people have to coordinate in order to save the species. They don't hunt the young, they don't hunt the pregnant female. They want to coordinate their hunting so that they can direct the herd into chill zones that is easily accessible to humans. So all of these is gonna invoke a response in animals. So it wasn't the intention of humans to make these animals like us or like get close to us. It happened probably as byproduct of some sort of human behavior, particularly regarding hunting. Probably there are, for example, in the case of, let's say dog and pig, these species were attracted to human for the most part because they were food around human. Second of all, they were a group of human, they were like food that these animals could use. Same is true with cats. So this particular pathway that I just said is called commensal pathway. There are other pathways. So there is there is a predator-prey pathway that most herd animals like cow and goat choose toward domestication. And that probably is more applicable to coordinated hunting between humans and not killing the vulnerable members of the herd, and probably trying to control that herd movement, like even by providing them with the food that they need in a certain location. And, the resource management strategy eventually resulted in species that were sort of ready for agriculture.
And so in the big picture is that that you're suggesting is not that these innocent hunter-gatherers were just doing things with wild beasts until suddenly they start domesticate them, and rather that there was a much more gradual process. Slowly they started co-evolving with humans, depending more and more on humans, especially along this running track of Homo erectus and later other hominin species.
Yes, there is absolutely nothing spontaneous and sudden. Everything is gradual.
Well, can we then make the link between the human migration out of Africa and, or like more generally, why does this particular band of lands from the east-west axis, from Turkey to China, why more here than somewhere else?
By the time Homo sapiens were, started spreading, Eurasian species have seen different types of humans. They gradually exposed to Homo sapiens. So they weren't as familiar with human behavior as African species, but not completely unfamiliar. So this means that human presence resulted in significant threat to these populations, but alongside changing human behavior, these species could change. They had the kind of evolutionary potential to adjust to human presence. So extinction happened, but mass extinction at a scale that happened in America or Australia didn't happen. So humans had incentive to do their management strategies because there was some instability, enough instability in animal population, more than in Africa. Species had the potential to respond, or had time to respond to human management. And most likely the combination of these two explain why low latitudes of Eurasia eventually became the cradle of mammal domestication.
What about the famous wild grasses that become the wheat, the barley, rice, beans, etc.?
So in the ice age environment, those environments favored large body size. It favored movements of big species, and then the smaller species, plants, use this animal particularly for the diffusion, dispersal of genes.
I see. So the seeds would travel in the belly of the mammoths for long distances.
What happened when these key species become less available? They became less available starting around 20 to 30,000 years ago, partly because of human impacts. Plant species that depended on these, like the wild grasses, the flowering plants that later became domesticated plant species. They started recruiting humans because if you depend on a species for seed dispersal and that the species is gone, you're going to look for an alternative. Who's there? Humans.
Yeah. But of course, given that plants are not consciously doing their Darwinian calculus, what does this look like in practice? Does it mean that the plants, that a lot of these grass species start to suffer, start to die out because they don't have the mechanism available. And then the few of those who might have had some kind of existing relationship with humans suddenly start blossoming because now they are the ones who have the evolutionary edge.
Yes. Mechanically, there's the survival of the most adaptable, Darwin's theory, which is like those species of plants who learn by probably accident or something to depend on humans can spread. Those who didn't have the chance or weren't able to became extinct.
So the reason then why this Eurasian band would have so many flowering grasses that have an existing or at least are tuned to an existence with humans that are then make them suitable for becoming the wheat, the barley, the rice, the beans, whatnot, is because these are areas where you say where these have dependent on large mammals like the mammoth or whatever, that some of them went extinct, their numbers did reduce. This did not happen in Africa.
At least to the extent that happened in Asia.
What about Americas?
There probably was a lot of pressure from evolution point of view for both humans and plants to adapt to each other fast. And they did. There were, I think if you count the number of species that were domesticated in the America, is pretty large. It didn't happen at the same time that happened in the in Eurasia. Why much later? So two reasons. First, human got there much later. Second is that, like, plant species need to understand who they are dealing with, again, from an evolutionary perspective. Like, they didn't know this bipedal ape exists, and probably the seed is not that much palatable to human compared to a Eurasian species. The seed, like avocado, like you see, like this massive seed. Why do we have that massive seed? It's not evolved for human. It's evolved for the giant slot that died. Even if you think about corn, like, I don't know, just ancestor of the corn that
the teosinte,
it does not look anything like the corn that we eat.
Well, no, fair amount of selection had to take place.
Yes.
And so that I mean, Diamond speaks about this fact that you have these large seeded grasses in Eurasia so much more than anywhere else that might have already been a product of humans walking over them, eating them, carrying them, depending on these wild grasses for much longer than we typically think.
Yes, you're exactly right. There is just evidence that Natufians were engaged in management of barley like pretty much around 15,000 years ago. It means that barley was being consumed by humans in one shape or another, like way before, probably 80,000 years ago when humans were born.
And so basically, am I right that the suggestion is that Africa and Eurasia had the plants, for example, that were for a long time probably being consumed by humans, and unlike America. But then Eurasia, unlike Africa, because it did start having the megafauna, big mammals, their population started declining, first slowly, then rapidly, which then put, first of all, emphasis on humans in managing these animals themselves. Okay, they start to evolve more in the kind of dance with humans. And also these grasses, for example, start to depend more on humans and not on these animals to carry their seed around. And lo and behold, we get the agriculture revolution first in this southern band of Eurasia. We get the quote unquote first civilizations. We get high population densities for millennia. We get trade, we get war, we get weapons from these animals, we get germs, and hence Eurasia.